Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to yet another edition of Truth to Power. My name is Faraz Patel. For the 1 hour, we have two amazing guests that are going to be on our show. From 3:30 to 4 o'clock, we have one of the struggle heroes of South Africa, one of the men who fought apartheid head on. It's none other than the former Minister of Intelligence, Mr. Ronnie Kasrils. And then from 4 to 4:30, we'll be speaking to the new Vice-Chancellor of the University of Witwatersrand, Professor Zeblon Vilakazi. So stay tuned to ITV Networks for the next 1 hour. Well, joining me now is a man who needs no introduction. Just this week, Israel had obviously wanted to go ahead and annex parts of the West Bank. That was halted due to international condemnation. But that does not stop Benjamin Netanyahu and the rest of the Israeli cabinet going ahead and annexing more land in the West Bank. This, of course, has drawn sharp condemnation across the world. And of course, Benjamin Netanyahu was aided by none other than US President Donald Trump. So joining me via Zoom is a man who needs no introduction. Of course, he fought the apartheid government head on. He's one of the struggle heroes of our country. It is none other than Mr. Ronnie Kasrils. Mr. Kasrils, assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for joining us here on ITV Networks.
Alaikum salam. Greetings to all the viewers. It's always good to be with you. Thanks for the invitation.
No, it's an absolute pleasure having a man of your stature. Mr. Kasrils, let's talk about what's going on in the Middle East. And for those who do not understand the human rights violations that have been broken, explain to the viewers just the crimes against humanity that have been committed by the government of Israel from the 1940s.
Well, what a chronicle of suffering, of oppression, of crime against people, against human rights, against international law. It already had begun pre-1948 when the infamous Declaration of Independence took place by the Israelis, aided and abetted essentially by Britain, the colonial power that had occupied Palestine, as we know, since the downfall of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War. The Zionist project goes back to the 1880s. Jews were living all over the world. They had once lived very well in Arab countries, from Iraq through to Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, and so on, in what had been called the golden age of Arab-Jewish relationship. And those Jews of Africa and what we call the Middle East were actually somewhat Arabic. They spoke the language, the culture. They differed in religion, and they got on very well. And it's very useful to remind ourselves that when Christian Europe, the Crusades, and later the Spanish Inquisition came down on Jews and Muslims as well, that was anti-Semitism. That's when it started. It starts with the colonial enterprise and gets to a point where Theodor Herzl, who, as we know, is a founder of Zionist doctrine, which is a political doctrine, the rabbis of the 19th century didn't support that idea. They regarded pilgrimage to Jerusalem as part of the way Muslims today regard a pilgrimage to Mecca, not as a place that you wanted to occupy and control and set up a state. But Zionists, who were actually, in the main, their leaders were agnostics and even atheists, they took hold of the Old Testament and they used it ideologically for the purpose of translating it in a highly fundamentalist manner, not the true faith of the people of the book, in which, let's face it, a lot of the stories and so on are based on mythologies. I'm not condemning faith-based groups or religions who use symbolism in a particular way to reinforce faith of the religion. But the Zionists then chose to use the Bible, the Old Testament, as though it's historical fact, giving them the right to dispossess the Palestinian people, the native indigenous people who had lived there for centuries on centuries. And in 1948, that Nakba began, in which, as we know, 700,000 of about 1 million people who lived in Palestine of their Arabic descent, who were either Christian or Muslim, were driven out at the point of a gun, frightened out, terrorized because of massacres that were deliberately taken place to create that reign of terror, such as older people, women and young children at Deir Yassin in April 1948. And that was the sweeping out of the Palestinian people, the ethnic cleansing, which was in parallel with murder and bloodshed to rid the land as people were dispossessed and moved as refugees into adjoining countries. So it was a land grab. It was daylight robbery and daylight murder. And that's why the Palestinians refer to it as a Nakba. And it continued. It continued every time the Zionist government elite of Israel saw the chance to expand land, which meant dispossessing more Palestinians. And the 1967 war, which they fomented, they always tried to put the blame on Palestinians or Arab states. 48, 67, they stole more land. And that occupation of the West Bank and Gaza has seen the greatest atrocities imaginable, in which we've seen hundreds, thousands of Palestinians being murdered, and children, and so on. And we must not forget the refugees that were created, who were driven into neighboring states, and who Israel will not allow back to their homes, which in international law, in terms of conflict where people are transplanted away, they have a right to return. But no, the way the Zionists have used their laws is to grant people who've never been in Palestine, whose ancestors were never there. Some of them, their Jewish ancestry is even questionable. We see this with 1 million or so Russians who were brought through to Israel over the last couple of decades or so. And the people with a Jewish background around the world, whether it's people even like myself, would have the right to return and to claim a place in Israel and citizenship just overnight. Whereas people who were driven out of their very homes, lost their property, with houses seized, pushed into the refugee camps, are not given the right of return. Inside Israel itself, 20% of the people are descendants of the 1948 Palestinians who managed to remain in place. They are second-class citizens in an apartheid state. So we now see the move to the latest land grab, courtesy of the United States, that replaced Britain as the great friend and benefactor, giving the land of Israel, that land to Israel, rather, which was from the Balfour Declaration, etc. The United States, the world imperialist power, taking over. So that what Zionist Israel has managed to visit upon the Palestinian people has been because these Western countries have supported them. and built Israel into the superpower it is. And this is why the Zionists, the Israeli military, and their successive governments have carried out with impunity the death, destruction, incremental genocide, as Ilan Pappé has referred to it, of the Palestinian people. And now the Trump plan, the deal of the century, has allowed Netanyahu, given him this green light to annex 32% of the shrinking portion of what Palestine was, the West Bank, to give a third of that virtually to Israel, so that over 500,000 of Israeli settlers, many from places like Brooklyn and the Bronx, or Russia and places like that, Britain, have settled in those illegal settlements and are now being given that judicial recognition, courtesy of Trump, and this annexation. So we've got to stop this. And I'm very pleased to say that here in South Africa, we've got a major campaign going, which stems, as you can see behind me, the Palestine flag with the South African one, the request from civil society, Palestinian civil society, and its BDS movement, to which the organization I belong to here, the BDS National Coalition, supports, and we take leadership from them, and we're part of what's called this Global South call on our own government, on the governments of the global South Africa, Asia, Latin America, together with those in the Middle East and friends and solidarity movements of Europe and the United States as well, to demand at the coming United Nations General Council, the Assembly in September, that governments of the world must call Israel to account if they go ahead with this annexation plan, and apply what we say in terms of my poster. The BDS call is pre this annexation, and certainly post. We want to see a mobilization of world governments through the United Nations to apply full boycott and sanctions against Zionist Israel for these sins, for the annexation. If they go ahead with it, we're calling for these sanctions. Trade, military arms must apply to Israel. And as South Africans, we've been asked to take a lead in this because, as we well know, the world community has regarded South Africa as a flag bearer of anti-racism, anti-discrimination in the world. And we experience BDS, international support against apartheid, Pretoria, apartheid South Africa, which was a powerful tool that led, in fact, to the weakening of the apartheid regime, so that with the intifada of the South African people, we were able to have the apartheid state removed. I am not a pessimist. Things can be very bleak for the Palestinian people 72 years into this horrific oppression and land dispossession with such brutality and cruelty. But the Palestinian people have, in Arabic, the samud, the resolve, the determination, never, never to give in. And with international support of the kind that I've been speaking, this gives them that additional support. We must isolate Zionist Israel. And incidentally, when they say people like myself as a self-hating Jew, or anyone who opposes Israel are anti-Semite, this is absolute rubbish and nonsense. We are not against a people. And we hear the Palestinians, we hear Arab people around the world, Muslim people, saying just that. We're against, as we said in South Africa, we were not against whites. We didn't talk about driving them into the sea. It was against a system, the apartheid system. That's what creates the imbalance in power relations, the cruelty, the brutality, the racism. And this is what has happened with Zionism. It's a creed of racism. It's a creed of exclusivity of people, including Christians, not just Muslims. And it is an absolute aberration against human rights and nobility. The last thing I want to say is we have a chief rabbi in this country who, together with a chief justice of the Constitutional Court, behaved in the absolutely most unacceptable manner. And that chief justice deserves to be cautioned for falling in line with that exclusivist biblical narrative that Zionism seeks to use to say that Zion, Jerusalem, the Holy Land, was given by the word of God to Abraham 4,000 years ago. And people can have faith, but when you have faith, it must not be at the expense of one people over another. It's got to be the golden thread of morality that runs through the people of the book, from Judaism to Christianity to Islam, that embraces as well Hinduism, Buddhism, all the faiths. And what is that? I learned that from a Jewish mother who, fortunately for me, was not a racist and wasn't a Zionist. She wasn't very political, but she simply said to me, my boy, the key thing of our Judaic learning is treat others as you wish them to treat you. That's all, and that's the central tenet of those faith-based religions and what Judaism had been until it's now been captured and being abused by the Zionist political doctrine, by Netanyahu, by the Christian evangelists, by Donald Trump. And we'll stop them. We must stop them.
Mr. Casserols, you just given us 10 minutes of amazing lessons right over there from somebody who, of course, fought against the apartheid government. And this is where my next question comes. You are underground. You went head on against the likes of Verwoerd, against the likes of Stradum, against the likes of P.W. Botha. The list goes on. Fighting in that struggle, what are the comparisons? Because I know there are so many, but what are the comparisons as a struggle veteran you can advise those Palestinians who want their freedom right now?
Never to give in. There were times in the struggle against apartheid where it seemed really bleak, and the Palestinians have seen this. They've been through such bleak times. But the central point is where your cause is a just cause, you won't be defeated. It's the justness of the cause against an immoral opponent, your enemy, your adversary, the system that is repressing you, to hold on to their wealth, their greed, the land that they have stolen. Yours is the just cause that gives you strength. It gives you the moral high ground. It gives you the support internationally, even when there are repressive and wicked imperialist governments who are siding with your oppressor. You stick to your beliefs and principle, and we see how the Palestinian people are providing their offspring, these incredible young people from generation to generation, with that motivating force that they have justice on their side. You then need to have tremendous resolve and commitment to your struggle. Never say die. We see people being prepared to give up their freedom, their lives. They won't be intimidated. And you tick the box with the Palestinians that they have that resolve, that samud. Then thirdly, there's the question of being united as a people. And those who repress will do their utmost to divide and rule. That's been the imperial order from time immemorial, from Roman rule through to British Empire, the American Empire, apartheid rule, split people, give some better off situation than others, create Bantustans, play on tribalism or religion, and you rule that way. So it's not as though it's simple to say, why aren't you united? But you have to work hard to ensure that you have that absolute rock firm unity. Then I would say, fourthly, is that you need in your organizations the people being people-based, not elitists from top down. Organizations you build must be at grassroots, and that's where the emergence of your leaders who are really committed morally and in every sense to serving the people, that the lessons of your repression, of your experience, must help to develop your theory, your vision, your strategies, and to choose the methods of struggle which will serve that struggle best. So you can go through periods where you move in a wrong direction, where instead of isolating the enemy, you can provide basis for the enemy to draw some strength from people who should be on your side, or managing to maneuver internationally to get support. Get your strategies right, get the methods you use correct. We went through a period of non-violent struggle. With Sharpeville, we changed to the use of armed struggle, etc. That's up to a people. The key thing is, whatever method, the people must be central. The organization, the mobilization of the people, the broad unity of your people, and with it, public organizations, youth, women organizations, strong trade unions, but all following your lodestar, your guiding star, your vision, your theorizing, and the strategy to ensure that everything you do is gathering the strength of the people, and with it the support of the international community, to isolate reaction and build up your strength, your power, your alliance. And in the end, that's going to be the breaking point in terms of the immoral forces, whether nationally and locally, and with the international immoral forces who are trying to maintain the status quo. And it's moving that way for the Palestinian people. And we see time and again how they rise up against loss of land, against the murder, against the genocide, against the bombs, and they find ways with the Intifada to move forward, and we give them the international support, which gives that extra weight to their struggle.
Mr. Casserols, just in 1 minute, because we have to wrap it up. President Cyril Ramaphosa is somebody that you know very, very well. Just in a minute, can you summarize the last 2 years of his presidency so far? Of course, things have been difficult with COVID-19 around, but how would you sum up his presidency so far? And do you believe he's still the right man to lead South Africa?
Well, I think if we look to what preceded his presidency, the 10 years of a Jacob Zuma government, that we breathed a sigh of relief when the Zuma period was pushed aside, Ramaphosa came to the fore, and there has been a great difference. He's got to contend with factions within his party. That's clear. I think he needs to show a stronger will, but he's showing a vision. He's serious. We see this in the way he's dealt with the pandemic. I think he's come to the fore there, and that people have really appreciated his gravitas, his clarity, and the right decisions were taken, essentially where he put the people's safety and health ahead of the economy. We see the opposite to that in Trump's America, which is why they're skyrocketing now with the illnesses taking place. In South Africa, yes, we are on the rise, but it's not because of that mismanagement. I think if they hadn't taken such clear-cut decisions from the start, we wouldn't have gained some space to deal all the better with the pandemic. So you said in a minute or so, I think what he's done with the pandemic challenge is also relevant to how he's striving to rescue the country from the economic problems, the unemployment issues, the marginalization of people. It's not easy, and I'm not saying that there's been no mistakes, but one thing that I'm taking optimism from is how he's been saying that to rescue us from this economic trough we're in is to invest very, very heavily in infrastructure development, building the roads, the dams, and the power and infrastructure of that like, which will create jobs, which will develop what we need to develop, not just finance capital and profit through banks and financial institutions, but creating material basis, technological basis in our country to produce work through the labor of our people put to work. And he must drive that through in a clear way and with strength and resolve and political will.
Mr. Casserols, you know, I had so many questions planned for you. Hopefully we can get you again on Truth to Power to discuss South Africa moving forward. Coming from a person like yourself, a veteran, somebody who of course took the apartheid government head on. We thank you so much for joining us.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you.
Walaikum salam. No, it's an absolute peace sign to you also. A great man, a man of wisdom, a man who really was there to fight that apartheid government head of, one of the struggle heroes, Mr. Ronnie Casserols. Well, coming up after the break, we are going to be talking to the new Vice-Chancellor of the University of Witwatersrand, Professor S01 Vilakazi. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Truth to Power. My name is Faraz Patel. Now joining us via Skype is the new Vice-Chancellor of the University of Witwatersrand, Professor S01 Vilakazi. Good afternoon, Professor, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon, and good afternoon to the viewers.
No, it's an absolute pleasure having you. Professor, I mean, you're not new to this university. I mean, you've been in this institution for a very, very long time. I think one of the questions that I would that is important is in terms of the leadership ability that you've developed over the years. And I think how important was it, learning from a gentleman like the outgoing Vice-Chancellor Adam Habib in taking this position for such a prestigious university?
Yes, indeed. I think it's been, I've enjoyed the last 7 years of working with the Vice-Chancellor, the outgoing Vice-Chancellor, Professor Habib. He is obviously has a different style. He has a much more engaging social presence in all media platforms. He's a formidable political sciences scholar. I'm a scientist, as you saw in my CV, a physicist. So we have a different approach. But that was enriching in the senior executive team when I served as a deputy vice-chancellor and of late as a vice-chancellor. And in the next 6 months, him and I will be working towards a transition. So I'm going to be learning a lot from him. In terms of what are things that I need to do that were beyond my current portfolio.
Professor Vilakazi, you, Loiso Nonka, and of course Professor Habib were the only 3 vice-chancellors of color, obviously during the democratic period. How important is transformation and making sure this is spread across all the major universities in South Africa?
Certainly, I think I don't want to repeat and give you a historical lesson of where we come from. I mean, when I went to Wits 2 or 3 decades ago, the university was an all-white institution, and we've come a long way in allowing the university to be representative. We have a huge number of Black students broadly, and Africans in particular. So in terms of the racial demographics, it's moved, the right way at the student level. Now the challenge is to ensure that the next level of professoriate also starts, becoming more reflective of the country. And that will take a long time because you don't produce a professor overnight. You don't just, microwave a professor. they have to publish, they have to go through a series of, levels of growth. And I think we need to create an inclusive environment. I take pride in a sense at VETS, in a sense that it's a very inclusive space for all religious groups, faith, racial groups, and also language groups. So I think that is, to me, our strength, that we are a diverse university that is currently going through transformation. I have to admit, though, that it's not a complete story. There are challenges that we face. It's a broad South African problem. And as you've seen abroad, it's a world problem, So it's something that we need to work on as society in a very measured and careful way.
And I think that transformation also extends to the sports field, where we're yet to see a lot of our national teams making that transition into transformation. Professor, of course, you're going to be leading this great organization into its centenary in 2 years' time. Just talk to us about how excited you are with taking this university into its centenary, because there's no doubt that the University of Witwatersrand is not only well known across the African continent, but globally also at the same time.
I recall that over the last 7 years of my tenure at VETS, we have gone through a challenge, to put it mildly, through the fees must fall and all other challenges that you're all aware of. And that was the period of a great test of character for leadership, in particular for the Vice Chancellor, then Professor Habib. And how we manage that is something that will be judged by history. But that being said, is that despite all those challenges, our research output more than doubled in that period. Our throughput of students has increased. We have increased the number of PhDs and master's graduates who are of color. I think that despite all the challenges that we face, the university has grown. So I'm picking up a university, I'm inheriting a university that already is on the right path in terms of growth. So my challenge is to take it to the next level. And I think, especially in the centennial year, I will be talking to all alumni of the university across all sections of the South African community to say, this was your home, it's your alma mater, and beyond just graduates and members of the university community, but just generally people of, shall I say, goodwill in South Africa who want to see success and wants us to build on the previous success and challenges of the last 7-8 years.
And I think you just mentioned about the inequalities that are still there. Of course, great strides have been made to make sure that those inequalities are erased, but they still exist, Professor. And exclusion, of course, is another one that remains one of the biggest challenges within the University of Witwatersrand and obviously other tertiary institutions. So how do you go ahead and change all of that? How do you now, as the Vice Chancellor, say, right, now it's time for us to at least take that next leap forward in making sure inequalities and exclusions of students are taken away?
You recall that earlier on I made that as part of the broader transformation project, despite academic excellence, which is central, is inclusion, right? That even if you have shifted in the right in the way of changing demographics, but you still contend with the issues of exclusion. People feel that the cultural framework of the institution is not for them, that the university reflects certain values that, do not include them. So therefore, you need to just broaden the values of the university to ensure that they just not only cater for the upper middle classes of a particular generation, but they cater for all our diverse backgrounds. And I think that is the challenge. It's an ongoing project that we started, but you need to emphasize that. And key to that is dealing with inequality. We do not get students who only not come from, neighborhoods and families that can afford things like data, devices, and so on and so forth. But some of our students come from, informal settlements, townships, and rural areas. And those challenges, no matter how talented they are, the accident of background and history, you don't want to burden a child with circumstances of their birth and accident of their birth. That just because I happen to come from a small rural village, I'm the first in my generation to study, then I come to VETS, then I flounder, not because I don't work hard enough, but because the institution doesn't take into account where I come from. And I think that's a big challenge, not only for South Africa, but not only for VETS, but for the other institutions as well. And that translates, if I might elaborate, it translates into high cases of depression as well among students.
Professor Vilakazi, I mean, you spoke earlier on about the fees must fall that happened, of course, 5 years ago in South Africa and subsequently carried on for the next year. Of course, the Bill of Rights says that every single South African has the right to an education, but also at the same time, quality education. Now, of course, any tertiary education institute would need money to obviously sustain the infrastructure and the development of the education within its institution. So how does one balance the Bill of Rights for each and every South African, and of course giving that quality education and maintaining the infrastructure that the university needs in order to have that sustenance?
That has been a headache for my predecessor. I think he's passing me that ball. That's one thing he said to me when him and I had a conversation last week, and he said to me, "Chief, this is your ball now, it's your baby. I'm out of here." Seriously speaking, obviously, I said that in a joking way, but just to illustrate the point that it's a challenge that we had. That it's a fine balance how to maintain the integrity of the institution and, of course, to address social justice. Of course, every talented student coming to the university who obviously meets our requirements for entry should not be excluded based on academic performance, but solely based on the financial need. And we've got a challenge here, Mr. Patel, of the missing middle. You know that the NSFAS system, I'm not sure if you're familiar with
I'm well aware of it.
Targets, it's aimed at working class and poor families below a certain amount of household income. But you've got a gap, a huge gap between those that are between 400,000 and almost R1 million in terms of household, who are largely in the lower middle classes. They form that missing middle gap. And I think that they're too poor to afford and too rich to qualify. I think that with Professor Habib, we started what is called a means-free, needs-blind system, where we'll actually look for funds beyond government, look for funds in many other areas through private companies, through alumni, through foundations to actually bridge that gap. And I think that will be the challenge for the next Vice Chancellor, who happens to have, put his name forward to see whether they can address the situation. But I think that is part of our centennial plan. Our great fundraising strategy is to come with this needs-blind academic performance scholarship.
Professor, as a world-renowned nuclear physicist, I mean, you've been across, I mean, looking at your CV, I mean, you've been across the entire globe, of course, discussing nuclear and, of course, everything with regards to it. Of course, there has been discussion about nuclear power that is needed for South Africa, of course, with coal slowly and surely becoming extinct. It may even be extinct at this very moment. So, as somebody who deals with this issue, what are the pros and cons with using nuclear power for future energy here in South Africa?
Yes, as you know, Mr. Patel, that there is a big concern around the world of global climate change. Just to give you an example, just to illustrate this, over the last 50 years, our amount of pollution emissions that have been released to the atmosphere have been increasing exponentially, right? This is not sustainable, and that is because we've had a fossil fuel-driven economic growth. Now, to get a more inclusive global environment where Africans also have to see an improvement in living standards, we cannot repeat the mistakes that the West made in chopping trees, in polluting the atmosphere. We are leaving our next generation, our children and grandchildren, a planet that is unsustainable. So there are renewables. I believe that new renewables like wind, like solar, and so on and so forth will help. Those alone are not the only solution in this big challenge. Nuclear can come in a measured way that will balance the mix. So I don't believe in purely going nuclear. It's too expensive. As we saw in the last 2 years, the nuclear debate, we cannot afford nuclear. But we need a much more measured approach towards nuclear. And I think, to me, as a physicist, I think it makes sense, but we need to get the right economic situation that allows us to have affordable delivery of well-scaled, well-measured nuclear contribution to the global, to the CO2 emissions of the planet.
Professor Vilakazi, of course, one of the leading researchers right now in vaccinology, Professor Shabir Madhi, of course, who is at the University of Witwatersrand, and he has specifically said that COVID-19 is going to be here for a very, very long time. Of course, when students do return, I know that Dr. Bladen Zimande did say that sooner or later students will have to return to their respective tertiary institutions. So when the students return to the University of Witwatersrand, as a university, what are the challenges facing the institution and students with regards to COVID-19? And as an institution, what is the University of Witwatersrand going to do to make sure that all the health protocols are in place to make sure that the safety of the students will remain the priority, and of course the staff members?
In particular, staff members, because most staff members are in the age category that is high risk, right? In particular, senior professors would be in their 60s or even sometimes in the 70s and even 80s. So they also need to be protected as well. And some of the students obviously come from households where they've got their loved ones, parents and grandparents who have comorbidities that when they go back home, they could also expose those loved ones. Now, our strategy is as following: that you know that the Department of Higher Education and Training issued a series of guidelines. At 30%, you have ensure that there's maximum social distance of about 2 meters or just over 6 feet tall, 6 feet. Basic hygiene, you know, wash your hands regularly. You know, behavioral change, Mr. Patel, is important. As the president said, it is in our hands, number one. I think we cannot abdicate our responsibilities as people to say it is in our hands. Secondly, we have got protocols we put in place in terms of operational safety and health. We monitor infections, we monitor people coming in and out of campus. And thirdly, because of the fact that as we are scaling up people coming to campus, we're starting with those that are in most need, like, for example, those that do like laboratory work, senior medical students, the final year MBBCH students are now on campus, and with all the protocols that we developed by Donald Gordon. And finally, we also must take into account, back to your previous question, of inclusion. My child can afford to have data, device that and Wi-Fi that they take for granted. But if you live in a deep slot, you cannot afford Wi-Fi, not devices. Even if we give you one, but the home environment doesn't lend itself conducive for you to study meaningfully. So what you've done is you've prioritized the social justice class of students to be put back on campus with all the social distancing, that they don't share bathrooms, that they are, well spaced, and you're looking at it very carefully. So that is, to me, the mix of all the things we're doing to isolate yet deal with social justice, that no child is left behind.
Prof. Vilakazi, just one final question. During your tenure, which is of course going to start very, very soon, where do you see the university beyond the centenary, and what are your plans in just making sure that the name of University of Witwatersrand maintains its high standards? Of course, you have been there before, you know the ins and outs of the university, but what are your plans as the Vice Chancellor just to make sure that when of course a child wants to come to the University of Witwatersrand, that decision will be justified?
Briefly, I don't want to maintain standards. I want to move the crossbar up.
Yes.
We must jump to the next level. The next level is, I want our graduates to be people who not only are just employable, but they must be creators of employment. What stops us? What stops us from having our students devising apps like the one I'm using, Talk to You? Why do you have to rely on information that you inherit from the United States, with products coming out of Stanford or MIT, when you've got so much talent in this country to produce? I mean, you've got a student, Mohammed, who actually produced a prosthetic arm.
Yes.
So we just need to harness that talent. I mean, there's so much talent within our system. It's just that the ecosystem doesn't allow. That will be, I'm a techie, so I will be taking that as one of my priority projects, that vets must be producing not only just new knowledge, but it must produce new technologies that will speak to our African problems, working with partners in industry, partners in government, both local and regional and national, and the society at large. That is the really one aim. I mean, I think that will be our centennial strategy. If we do this, or even we do half of it right, then we will have achieved a lot. I know it's a big plan and still coming in fresh, so I might be a bit naive and blind, but at least we will fail having tried to have made a much bigger impact than we are doing now.
Professor S01 Vilakazi, we thank you so much for making the time for us, and all the best with your new role as the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Witwatersrand. I think what made this interview even so special is that both you and I are from the East Rand. I know that you are from Katlehong, I'm from Benoni, so I think this just made the conversation even more special. We thank you so much.
Thank you, and that's where great people come from.
Definitely, I agree with you on that. The East is definitely the best. Professor S01 Vilakazi, the new Vice-Chancellor of the University of Witwatersrand, speaking to us here on Truth to Power, just to give us his plans and, of course, the way forward with regards to the institution that is, of course, the University of Witwatersrand. Well, this has been another edition of Truth to Power. Of course, earlier on we had spoken to the former Minister of Intelligence Services and one of the struggle heroes against the apartheid government, Ronnie Kestrels, discussing the annexation of more Palestinian land, and of course a brief interview with regards to President Cyril Ramaphosa's presidency so far. We'll see you again, same time, same place, right here on ITV Networks. From myself, Faraz Patel, do have yourself a good afternoon and a fantastic weekend. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.